Why do we need cheap food? We need cheap food because wages are so low.
Raj Patel is an academic, author, and activist. He's been called a rock star in the food justice movement and even a messiah. So I sat down with him at UT Austin's Microfarm to get the skinny on the global food system.
How is it that we can have so many people who are starving and so many people who are obese at the same time?
Well, I mean, the driver is always the same. It's poverty. If you are starving in the world today, it's because you don't have enough money to be able to buy food. And that's as true in the United States as it is elsewhere. So in the United States, we have 50 million people who are food insecure, who at some point during the year don't have enough money to be able to buy their next meal. And globally, the reason we have around a billion people who are malnourished, the reason that they are going hungry, again, is because they are too poor to be able to buy good food. But if you are able to buy food of some description and you still remain poor, then the kinds of options that are available, particularly in cities, aren't very good. With the rise of industrial and processed food, there are far more easy calories available and far less nutritious good calories available and good food available. And that's one of the reasons why we live in a world that has 1 billion people who are starving and nearly 2 billion people who are now overweight.
It's the start of the weekend in the Saudi Arabian city of Jeddah. And across the center of town,
Give me chili cheese.
burger joints like this one are jumping.
We have beef, chicken, shrimp.
The Counter is a chain from California that first came to Saudi Arabia in 2013 and recently opened a second popular spot.
Hey, this is price for takeout.
What is it about burgers and Saudis?
I mean, it's a global trend when it comes to burgers, especially gourmet burgers. Saudi Arabia has taken it to an extreme.
Khalid Al-Dajani is half British, half Saudi,
So these are a couple of the burger builds.
and knows this American brand, The Counter, is just one option in a highly competitive marketplace.
We have so many burger concepts in between Jeddah and Riyadh. You could actually, I think, have a different burger once a day in a week, maybe even more. I think you can have maybe for 2 weeks.
Wouldn't be very good for you.
No, it wouldn't. It would be another one of those supersize me kind concepts where you'd need a doctor on call.
Fast food is hardly new here. McDonald's opened the first of 80 outlets back in 1993. But as gourmet franchises attract a growing number of Saudi customers, growing Saudi waistlines have attracted serious medical concerns.
I expect in the next 5 years or so, the obesity epidemic will continue rising.
So now we'll start our procedure.
Dr. Ayad Al-Khatani is a top obesity surgeon here and is performing triple the number of gastric bypasses he was a few years ago.
Here in Saudi Arabia, we estimated maybe 20,000 deaths per year related to obesity. 20,000 is a huge number.
Data from several recent studies show that more than a third of Saudis are now obese, with almost 70% considered clinically overweight. But in a country where daytime temperatures top 120 degrees Fahrenheit, poor diet is only part of the problem.
The lifestyle in Saudi Arabia is mostly driving the cars, not walking, not doing a lot of physical activities.
Abdul Rahman Hadrawi has not worked out in years, he says,
ankle sprain.
and hopes stomach surgery will help lose almost half his body weight.
Do you think there is too much fast food in Saudi Arabia today?
Yes.
Is it a problem?
Yes. And you know, all the companies here of the fast food is origin from America or from another country.
Yeah, pull it back.
And according to his doctor, the medical expertise and equipment used to treat obese patients here also comes from overseas.
So both the hamburger and the techniques are coming from America.
Yes, you're getting the cause and the solution together.
So I will serve your drinks and your large cheddar with bacon.
Perhaps the best solution for Saudis facing so many fast food options
So you want a running egg?
may simply be to make better choices.
Images in this story may disturb some viewers, but they're necessary to show what is happening in one of the world's most desperate places, trapped in a brutal war that the United States is supporting through a Saudi-led coalition. Special correspondent Jane Ferguson has just returned from rebel-held Yemen, and tonight brings us the first of 3 reports from behind rebel lines.
Life is slipping away from Maimona Shagadar. She suffers the agony of starvation in silence. No longer able to walk or talk, at 11 years old, little Maimona's emaciated body weighs just 24 pounds. Watching over her is older brother Najib, who brought her to this remote hospital in Yemen, desperate to get help. The nurses here fight for the lives of children who are starving.
Because of the war, she is suffering from malnutrition. Her father is jobless. Most of the families in Yemen are jobless.
Every day, she says she sees these sorts of cases. People have lost work, therefore they've no money, therefore there's just no food in the house.
You were never supposed to see these images of Maimona. A blockade of rebel-held northern Yemen stops reporters from getting here. Journalists are not allowed on flights into the area. No cameras, no pictures.
The only way into rebel-held Yemen is to smuggle yourself in, and for me, that means to be dressed entirely as a Yemeni woman with a full face veil just to get through the checkpoints.
I traveled across the embattled front lines to see what's actually happening inside what the United Nations is calling the world's worst humanitarian disaster.
Hello.
The Houthis cautiously welcomed me in, and once I was there, watched me closely. The hunger here and this human catastrophe is entirely man-made. Yemen was already one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, and the war has pushed an already needy people to the brink of famine. In the midst of political chaos in Yemen after the Arab Spring, Houthi rebels from the north captured the capital Sana'a in 2014, before sweeping south and causing the country's then president to flee. Neighboring Sunni Saudi Arabia views the Houthis, from a Yemeni sect close to Shia Islam and backed by rival Iran, as an unacceptable threat along their border. So it formed a military coalition of countries in 2015, determined to defeat the Houthis and reinstate the old president. Crucial military support for the campaign is provided by the United States, a longtime ally of Saudi Arabia. After 3 years of aerial bombardment and fighting on the ground, the coalition has so far failed to dislodge the rebels. What the campaign has done is devastate the economy, leaving 2/3 of the population relying on food aid for survival, and over 8 million people on the brink of starvation. I traveled across this country to see for myself what that looks like. Since ancient times, Yemenis have lived securely in villages perched high up on mountaintops. But now, they can't hold off the hunger, like in Rafia village.
Because most of the people in these areas are so desperately poor, they cannot afford to transport their children into the towns to the hospitals whenever their malnutrition gets so bad their lives are in danger. And so many of the worst cases are in small villages scattered all around these mountain ranges, just like this.
Hannah and her little brother Ali are frighteningly thin. Their grandma tells me food prices shot up beyond their reach when the fighting started.
1 month after the war started, we were starving. We are dying from hunger and we don't know what to do.
Their dad, Ahmed, picks up occasional work whenever it's available, but most of the time, all he can afford to give them is a smile. Nearby sits Gibran, so frail he can no longer walk. The Saudi-led coalition imposes a blockade on rebel-held Yemen because they say Houthi rebels are bringing in weapons from Iran. All food coming into the country must get approval from Saudi Arabia. That process is frustratingly slow and has helped push food prices up.
Our silos.
Yahya Al-Habari is one of Yemen's main importers of wheat. He says Saudi inspections in nearby ports hold everything up.
All our wheat shipments, which each shipment worth about 16 to 18 million US dollars. It stops, in Djibouti for 6 to 5 weeks, which every single day costs us 25,000 US dollars demurrage for the ship owners.
Bridges have been bombed and businesses destroyed by airstrikes. Government workers in Houthi-controlled areas of the north haven't been paid in 2 years. Before the war, the Yemeni government was the country's biggest employer by far. When wages suddenly stopped, millions lost their livelihoods. Stephen Anderson runs the United Nations World Food Program in Yemen.
A very simple fact is that most of the civil servants, as from September 2016, have no longer regularly received their salaries. That's affecting the civil servants with their families. That's almost 9 million people out of a country of 28, 29 million.
That's what happened to Maimona's family. Her father was a public school teacher, a job that pays middle-class wages here. Now, with almost no money coming in, they are destitute. I went back to the hospital to check on her a few days later. Her mother had arrived from their village.
My husband now receives half a month's salary in 1 year, and when it comes, we have debts to pay that are more than the salary. The house is full of kids, and we don't have anything to give them.
Maimona was feeling better after some treatment. The doctors have saved her life for now, but the money problems that nearly killed her will still be there when she returns home. The Saudi-led bombing campaign and blockade have brought Yemen's economy to its knees. The Houthis also make life difficult for aid workers to get access to the most needy. Mistrust and harassment of foreign aid organizations is pervasive. They are on the ground here, but most international staff stay in the capital.
Camps like this are very close to the fighting and the intensive airstrikes just over there. International aid workers cannot access areas as dangerous as this very often, and even the Yemeni aid workers often struggle to help these people.
Meanwhile, the crisis is spiraling, with the number of people going hungry rising by the day.
Human cost of the war.
Lise Grande heads up the UN's humanitarian efforts in Yemen.
Most of the 8.5 million people that we describe as being pre-famine, the reality of their life is that when they wake up in the morning, they have no idea if they will eat that day. No idea. 8.5 million people are in that category. The UN estimates that by the end of the year, if there is not an end to this war, another 10 million Yemenis will be in that same situation. That's 18 million innocent civilians who are the victims of this war. And that's why all humanitarians are saying, enough is enough. There has to be a political solution, and the parties to the conflict have to sit at that table and agree on how to stop this.
The warring parties are not yet listening to that call. Last month, an offensive for Hodeidah city, currently controlled by the Houthis, was launched by the Saudi-led coalition. Almost all the food coming into rebel-held Yemen travels through that port. A battle risks shutting it and cutting off supplies to millions. If they hope to survive, the malnourished children arriving into Yemen's hospitals will need to hold on even longer for this disaster to ease. The truth is, many of them won't outlive this war. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jane Ferguson in Hajjah, Yemen.
And now, after her reporting trip to Houthi-controlled Yemen, we have our intrepid special correspondent, Jane Ferguson, here in our studio. Jane, that was very hard to watch, such important reporting, which leads me to this question. It's been difficult for reporters to get to where you got behind rebel lines. How did you do that?
To get in, I had to go alone. I tried for a very long time to see if it was possible to bring a team in, a cameraman of my own, and that wasn't possible simply because I had to be smuggled in. As you saw in the piece there, I was dressed as a Yemeni woman. So that was the only way to get past the checkpoints. And otherwise, essentially, it's just a case of driving in and hoping you're not asked for ID and turned back or arrested on the way.
So tell us a little bit about you. There are two more stories to come in this series. Tell us a little bit about them. The first one explains more of what the U.S. role here is.
That's right. The next story that will be up, we'll be talking about the aerial bombardment of these areas. There's been an aerial campaign a bombing campaign against the Houthi rebels, and that has been essentially carried out by the Saudi-led coalition of countries that are fighting the Houthis. But there is a role played by the US military, one that is sort of more passively behind and not quite as visible. And so we're going to be looking at that role.
And just quickly, the third report then in the series, the Houthis themselves, who are they, their connection to Iran?
They are a group, which is becoming more well known as this conflict carries on. But because the journalists aren't able to get into those areas, that's also been hindering a greater understanding of who they are. They've been accused by the Saudis and the Americans of having very close relationships with Iran, being completely armed by Iran, being allied with Hezbollah, having more of a formal relationship with them. They say that that's not the case at all. They have a political alliance, a philosophical alliance, but that they themselves are an independent Yemeni group fighting against what they see as an invading force.
It becomes such a subject of political dispute, including right here in this country. Jane Ferguson, such important reporting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the section on malnutrition. We'll talk about food security and obesity and undernutrition and things like that. You should have just watched a couple videos about the paradox in our world right now between people that have too much to eat and people that don't have enough to eat. According to most research, the issue currently facing humans on the planet is not really population itself, but the fact that food is not distributed equally amongst people. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here explaining some of the terms from the readings and some of the ideas and criticisms that the authors had about how we're trying to fix these problems in the United States, and also just to give you some definitions of some of the terms so you understand more of what they're saying. The videos you watched were about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, which is probably one of the starkest examples of food inequality in the world at the moment, since Yemen, as you saw, is hitting a famine, and Saudi Arabia is one of the fattest countries in the world. And Saudi Arabia is actually creating this situation for the people. And I like to use that example because not only because it's in the news right now, but it's also very stark, and it helps illustrate how unequal distribution and access can really hurt people. So I'm going to define a few terms here, beginning with what malnutrition actually is. So hunger and malnutrition, they're not the same thing. Food security, they're not all the same term. So undernourishment is actually increasing right now in the world. If you look at this chart here, if you look from 2015 to 2016, which is when we don't have very many statistics after 2016 right now, you can see that there's been a sharp rise in the amount of undernourished people in the world. Looking at it from a worldwide perspective, it was going down, but now it's going back up again. And what they mean by undernourished is, this is from the World Health Organization, and they have a equation that they use. They take the amount of food available per person, and they have an inequality access matrix that they use, and then they apply the minimum of calories that you need. And when all this is put together and it comes out negative, they consider people to be undernourished. And basically what it means is they just can't get enough food to live a healthy life. So this is about amount. And on the flip side of that, we have obesity is rising at an alarming rate around the world right now, and that's done by using BMI, body mass index, which is the weight, your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared, and if that's greater than 30, you're considered to be obese. There are some issues with this measurement, but it's the best that we have. It tends to be quite a crude measurement when it comes to obesity because it doesn't take into account other factors. Some people may have a high BMI and still be healthy, and we'll talk about that in the next section when we talk about critical nutrition, where people are beginning to question whether this is a valid measurement for people across the board, since we all have different environments and different genetics. Even though we're 97 or 99% the same, humans are very homogeneous as a species, but there are differences, and there's things that can happen in our DNA and things that can happen in the environment that may make people have to have more weight. So keep that in mind as you look at these things, but this is the measurement that we use, and it tends to be a pretty good measurement, especially when it starts getting really high into the obesity range. The overweight range, there's a lot of argument there. So people are getting fatter, and at the same time people are being undernourished. So there's a paradox in the world right now that Raj Patel, the guy that you watched the movie about, he has a book called Stuffed and Starved where he talks about that pretty extensively. And if you ever want to know more about it, that's a great book to pick up and check out about this paradox that we have in the world right now. So I'm going to focus on the United States because that's what your readings were mostly on. When you should have read one about global hunger and then about Julie Guthman, about local obesity and the environment, and how we're kind of trying to switch gears right now in the academic world, because for a long time we looked at food environments and tended to be fairly geographically deterministic, and what we're finding now with most of the research is that it's a much more complex problem than that. So how we measure access in the United States, we call food security. And around the world. So this is from the Food and Agriculture Association of the UN. So food security means that you have access to the sufficient safe and nutritious food that you need for what they call an active and healthy life. So it's not an exact measurement, but it's pretty good in saying that people aren't exactly hungry. They just can't get the food that they need to live the life that they need to live. And when it comes to food security in the United States, we have measurements specific to our own. When you see studies that say there's this many people that are food secure in the world, there are actually indicators that we use for that. So the indicators that we use in the United States have to do with food security on a household level to figure out whether people are not getting the food they need. We do not use any sort of indicator for hunger in any of our measurements. So hunger is a personal thing. Hunger means that you have an involuntary lack of food, and it actually physically hurts you. It causes pain. So hunger is something that is a discomfort because you don't have enough food. And we don't actually measure this in the United States. Other countries measure this, and this is where famine comes from. Famine is a word that really doesn't have a concrete definition yet either. If you read some of the research on famine, the UN and the WHO, they still haven't decided exactly what famine means. But really what it boils down to is you have the vast majority of the population is experiencing hunger, a physical deprivation of food. In the United States, we send out this survey every year. This survey is done by the Census Bureau when they do their community population survey, which is an estimate. Obviously, every 10 years they try to do as full of a survey as they can, but every year there is one put out that is statistically significant. And they ask questions to people that have to do with whether they're able to access the food that they need. And there's two main categories. There's either food secure or food insecure. When your food security is high, you say that you never had problems getting food, the food you needed, the food you preferred. You could be marginally food secure, which means maybe one or two times throughout the year you had either anxiety about not having enough food, but your diet didn't really change because of that. So that's food security. And then food insecure, if you have low food security, that means you had multiple times where you had either you had to buy foods that weren't the quality that you wanted to buy, but you still had enough food to eat. Very low food security means that there were times when you did not have enough food to actually stave off your hunger. And they used to call this very low secure with hunger, but they don't say that anymore in our research. So these are the questions they ask them. If you go to the community population survey, you can find a copy of this, and they have a report every year that they put out that reports on the amount of food security we have in the United States. Currently, last year's food security survey was actually a little less. There was a little less food insecurity in the United States. It was over 12% in 2016, and now it's at 11.8. Not much of a difference, but as you can see here, 88% of the United States, the homes are actually food secure. There was low security, though, in 7%, and very low security in 4.5%. These numbers actually go up when you look at certain variables. Houses with children tend to have higher food insecurity when you look inside the ones that are food insecure. Houses that have children and also poor people makes a huge difference. So the vast majority of the people that are food insecure also live in poverty, and minorities. African Americans especially tend to be a large portion of those in the food insecure category. So that's one side of malnutrition, not having enough food and not being able to feed yourself. And then on the flip side of that is having too much food or too much of the wrong food. And there's been a few pretty good comprehensive reviews done over the last few years that are looking at obesity. And obesity is one of the indicators of having too much food. So when your BMI is over a certain level, you're considered obese. And it tends to mean that you're eating too much, but not necessarily. This was a review article done in June of 2012 where they went through and they looked at as much as they could about the obesity in the United States, and they tried to project what it would be. And what this shows here, if you look at the this is the linear trend here. The actual is the green right here, and they project that it's going to, by 2030, it's going to be up around here of obesity in the United States, which pushing 40%. Severe obesity, they project actually this will be up over 10%. So we, 10% of our society, just like the globe, may possibly be food insecure when 10% of our society will be severely obese. And as Raj Patel said in the movie you saw, a lot of that has to do with poverty. If you can't afford the food you need to be healthy, you're going to buy food that tends to be fattening. Another research article that was done, this is a really interesting one, talking about how diet affects health. And they went through and in 2016 or 13, I'm sorry, and they looked at all of the studies that have been done about food and how food affects your health. And what they found was through the evidence, so this is actual evidence-based stuff, so it doesn't mean there was one study that showed, this food's better than that food. These are all long-range studies, and in aggregating all of the information together. And what they found with this is there are certain foods that are beneficial and other foods that are harmful, that will actually make you healthy or not. I'm sorry about there being a lot of stuff on this slide, but and obviously, fruits, nuts, and fish, vegetables, are at the top of that. And then at the bottom, you have your trans fats and processed meats, high sodium, and butter sits just below them. And so there's a lot of stuff out there that talks about whether food's healthy or not. The media tends to pick up one or two studies, and all of a sudden, this is good for you, this is bad for you, this is good for you. But these review studies that are being done are beginning to show that there are certain things that actually can beneficially make you healthier. And the reason I show this is because those foods at the top tend to be more expensive. And when we talk about food insecurity and malnutrition, we tend in our society to blame the person for it. You can make a decision, you can eat better food, but that tends to ignore a lot of other variables. It tends to ignore social norms. It tends to ignore culturally appropriate foods that are healthy for people, the environment people live in, things like that. It's a very complex structure when it comes to food choice. And I like to look at this right here. This is a great visual of all the different things that go into whether or not you're going to eat certain foods. And even just on the individual level, if you look right there, that's a lot of things right there. A lot of behaviors that are cultural, that are social. And then as you move your way out, race, social class, all these things, and out further, where you work, the school you go to, and then what kind of area you live in, based on agriculture and things like that. There's governmental controls, there's global controls. When there starts being tariffs on certain foods, some foods may start getting more expensive. So it's a really complex situation. We tend to blame the individual, or we tend to blame one variable over another variable, and that's not always the case when it comes to eating healthy food and being food secure. So obviously malnutrition has multiple causes. And one of the causes on a global scale that's becoming very prominent is the fact that people's food ways are shifting, and they're shifting quickly. Within one generation, people will go from being subsistence farmers to actually being part of the global economy through tourism and other things like that. One great example is in the Cook Islands. In the Cook Islands, where obesity is higher than almost anywhere else in the world, people have shifted from growing their own food to importing food within a very short amount of time, and non-communicable diseases, which are caused by the wrong food, mainly things like diabetes, type 2 diabetes, that's running rampant in countries like this. And the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN is doing a lot right now to try to fix this problem. So here's an example. This short video here is from the Cook Islands, and it shows how quickly people became obese and how their food ways are shifting very drastically.
When I was a kid, We eat mostly fresh fish and the green pawpaw, taro and the kumara and the maniota. Yeah, the population nowadays, I know lots of people, they prefer the takeaway other than the cooking anything else. I think that's why there's a lot of sickness around, diabetes and all that.
Here in the Cook Islands, according to the Ministry of Health, a staggering 88% of all men surveyed in 2012 were obese, and 75% of adult deaths are due to nutrition and lifestyle-related disease, or non-communicable diseases, NCDs.
So more vegetable, less carbohydrate.
A loss of life because of NCD is not just a loss of life, it's a loss of a father, a mother, a sister, a brother. It's a loss of income for that family. It's a loss of productivity for this country. So to us, there's a lot to be made from investing in your health.
To this end, the Ministry of Health has developed a Get Physical campaign, which asks islanders to spend at least 10 minutes a day doing a physical activity, 5 days a week. It also encourages the consumption of 5 fruits or vegetables a day, and the government has also raised import duties on sugary drinks, particularly in a bid to improve the health of the nation's youth, for whom the figures are alarming.
There's been a 34% of male and 24% of female recorded as being obese in the 2012 school survey that was conducted here in the Cook Islands.
Every year, the 15 islands which make up the Cook Islands state see around 130,000 tourists visit their atolls and lagoons. But their geographic uniqueness is also a hindrance, as the islands are massively import dependent. 82% of the nation's food arrives in weekly flights and on boats. Luxury resorts now stand on land formerly used for agriculture, and many islanders now work in the tourist sector, which accounts for over 90% of the island's economy.
In the 50s, 60s, when we come back from school, and the first thing we have to do is go out in the plantations to fetch our food or to go out fishing. But nowadays, because there are more money around and people can afford it, so we see a lot of these people going out to the market or buying food, junk food, or takeaways.
Recognising the need to combine resources, the head of research and development at the Ministry of Agriculture, William Wigmore, has been working with nutritionists to identify highly nutritious fruits and vegetables to introduce to the islands, in partnership with the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO.
We have a huge problem with NCD, and one of the difficulties in this country is that we do not have a consistent supply of fruits and vegetables to the market. So under this current FAO project, we're looking at increasing our production of vegetable seedlings from the nursery and also fruit trees. And these can go out to the farmers at a discount price. At the same time, any individual can come and purchase these seedlings to supply the needs of the family.
While encouraging better health, developing the domestic market should also have an impact on the country's import dependence.
Look out for this logo. Go Local, produce of the Cook Islands.
The Go Local campaign started 3 years ago. I've talked to the retailers and they're very supportive of it. The hotels want to buy local. The challenge is to provide enough and produce enough.
Bolstered by the ready market provided by a successful tourism sector, the potential for farmers here seems apparent. This green capsicum is selling in the supermarket for $9 New Zealand dollars 90 per kilo. It's fresh and of comparable quality to the New Zealand import, which is selling for $31.30 per kilo, over 3 times more expensive. But for the time being, the import of fruits and vegetables seems unlikely to diminish.
Most of the reason simply because there's no new farmers coming into play. We have our old farmers who is probably between 60, 70 plus, and they make up 80% of the farmers.
It's a problem Tupou Heather also recognises.
Kids nowadays doesn't want to be farmers. If they don't want to be farmers, then once we are gone, that's it.
However, at least this farming family are encouraging their 15-year-old grandson, Stanley, to farm. And Stanley also helps Tupou at the main Saturday market in Rarotonga, where he can see the benefits of their work and the potential earnings that farming can provide here.
We don't let them just wander around, like other kids. They have nothing to do at home. So our 15-year-old have to do all these things.
But Stanley is no different to most other teenagers in the Cook Islands, and he too enjoys an occasional trip to a popular takeaway.
He likes trips when he goes to the palace. Then that's just a Saturday when he play rugby. It's his time off.
So in the United States, our foodways have shifted mainly through the influence of large companies that tend to have a lot of influence in our government and in our economy, and foods that tend to not be as healthy tend to be cheaper. And a lot of this has to do with the subsidies that are provided to companies. If you look at these two pyramids here, the one on the right is what the USDA suggests that you should eat for good nutrition, and the one on the left is the amount of subsidies given to companies to grow particular foods. So as you can see, meat, dairy is up there at the top of the pyramid, and if you look at the amount of subsidies they're given, they're the bulk. 73% of the subsidies given to farmers and to food corporations are in the meat and dairy industry. The food guide pyramid that we're all used to seeing, this thing right here, shows you should eat a certain amount of bread and cereal, pasta, a certain amount of fruit and vegetables, a little bit of meat, a little bit of milk, yogurt, cheese, and then fats, oils, and sweets on top sparingly. And the base of that thing is bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. And a lot of medical professionals and academics have been looking into this, and really it should look more something like this. We're kind of heavy on the whole grains there, but vegetables and fruits should actually be half of what you eat. And then, you can use healthy oils up on top there. You should drink a lot of water, but it shouldn't really be a pyramid shape. It should look more like a plate, with things next to it. But having the meat and poultry in there is really interesting because the meat industry spends a lot of money to make sure that those items are there, and also with things like bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, things like that. These are the largest corporations that control most of the food, and a lot of their food has to do with high starch, high fats, things like that. And they spend a lot of money to make sure that they are represented on the food pyramid. This is the amount of money that each of these corporations last year spent on lobbying Congress. So millions of dollars, and this doesn't include donations to campaigns also, which they spend a lot on that. So our nutrition education is heavily influenced by the corporations that are creating this cheap food. And this tends to hurt people mainly when they're in poverty. So really the number one cause of food insecurity and malnutrition in the United States is poverty. Like it says here, last year when they did the community surveys, the highest percentage of food insecurity were in poor households, minority households, and single-parent households. And if you look here, the amount of money that's spent by people that are poor, 72% of your money is spent on housing and 28% is spent on food, and that doesn't leave anything else, right? That's it. Middle-class people, 30% on housing, 12% on food. So poor people tend to spend a large chunk of their income on food, and when you spend that much of your income on food, your decisions are based on how much you can get for as cheaply as possible. And this idea that being poor does not allow you to eat well, in the book they talk about structural violence, and this is a form of structural violence. Structural violence is an idea that was put forth by Johan Galtung right here. He wrote an article in the 60s in the late 60s about violence that happens to people that isn't physical. So there's multiple types of violences. There's physical violence on people, but he also talked about structural and cultural violence. And because of structural violence, you can actually be hurt without anyone physically hurting you or even intentionally hurting you. So the idea that people don't have enough money to buy the amount of food that they need or the right kind of food they need is a form of this structural violence. He created a framework that looks like this. You have observable violence, explicit violence, and then you have abstract violence that you don't actually see. It's just there. And most violence is cultural or structural. Direct violence is actually a small amount of the violence triangle in his perspective. So a lot of social science researchers currently are being guided by this idea of structural violence. Paul Farmer's a great example. He's a medical anthropologist who started a group called Partners in Health, where they go around the world and they deal with this idea that certain people, because they don't have access to things, are physically being harmed. So here's a short little video of Galtung talking about what this means, because he can explain it better than I can.
I've been working with three concepts. One is the direct violence, which has an actor who intends hurt and harm. It's intended. It's very important. And it's usually short and quick, and sometimes lethal, sometimes not. But it is intended. Then we have the structural violence, which is the social structure grinding out suffering, like the capitalist system does, like is done by authoritarian regimes, and it hits people at the most vulnerable points, and those vulnerable points are called basic needs. So they can hit the wellness, health. So you have misery at the bottom of society. People die to the tune of 125,000 a day without anybody firing a bullet. They die of hunger, and they die of diseases that are totally preventable and curable. But they don't have the money to do anything about it. So the structure is made in such a way that they are just the helpless victims of it. Or politically, they're deprived of freedom. And since they are set on a monochromatic, so to speak, track, with no choices, they become much less than they could be. Or their identity is taken away from them, and they're given another identity, like, let us say, the 800,000 Hawaiians. In Hawaii, when the white man came, and so many of the children were shipped off to the mainland to be taught English, Christianity, and baseball, becoming good Americans. Now you can imagine that they landed between two chairs, neither accepted as Hawaiians nor as Americans. The structural violence is not intended, but it's caused by a very important concept, not the act of commission, but the act of omission. The condition for maintaining structural violence is that nobody does anything about it. So we let it happen. And somebody would even say, this is normal, this is what normal society is like. It isn't. And here we in the Scandinavian countries, we had a lot of structural violence, but with very simple measures. We were able to make the society less vertical, more horizontal, with health resources available all over it. And it made a lot of difference, in a sense, from a two-class society to a one-class society. Now the gap is opening again, because the poor people of yesteryear have become middle class and have no compassion with those who are suffering today, and the gap is opening again, the structural gap. They don't intend to harm people, but they don't do very much to prevent it either. And then the third type of violence, what I call cultural violence, which are the aspects of culture that legitimize one or the other or both of the other two. Social Darwinism, the type of Christianity that sees sickness as God's punishment, been extremely important. Nationalism to justify direct violence, or US exceptionalism to somehow make Americans believe that they have not only a right to start killing in Iraq, but even a duty to do so. So you have a triangle with three types of violence that feed into each other.
So one of the main issues in finding food is access to food, and we talk a lot about food deserts, and food desert is something that's made its way into the common language in the United States and around the world, especially when people are talking about food environments and getting food and inequality and things like that. And the Guthman chapter you read is about food deserts and also food swamps. Food swamps are like suburban areas where there's tons of food that's bad for you. And we tended for years to really be focusing on obesity and food insecurity and things like that, and looking at where people live and what kind of access they actually have to food. And this is where the idea of food desert came from. It's a pretty horrible name because deserts actually have a lot of things in them. But it was a useful tool to try to map out people that lived in areas that did not have access to healthy food. And it's an idea that in theory seems to be a good idea, but the way that it's measured and how it's been used really has not reflected reality. So this is a really long quote right here, but this is Julie Guthman in a different article talking about our myopic view that we've had in food studies, especially when talking about obesity and food environment. It's been very supply side. And like she says, we've had an issue of what's called problem closure. So we've looked at people's obesity rates based on geography, and then we look around and then we see that, oh, they don't have a lot of supermarkets around them. So obesity is caused by lack of supermarket in your neighborhood. And if we just inject things like farmers markets and, workout spaces and community gardens and things like that, and put supermarkets in, then all of a sudden, people are gonna use these things, and we won't have what's known as an obesogenic environment. But as she points out, this ignores a lot of the structural issues. So going back to the idea of structural violence. So the social structures are ignored when you just look at the environment. This is a form of determinism. Determinism is the idea that because you live in a certain place, you are going to do something. Biological determinism is the idea that because of your genes, you are going to do this. So there's all different types of determinism, but geographical determinism is the idea that you live somewhere, and because you live there, you're going to be fat. And it's a very short-sighted way of looking at it. And also the measurements they used, she points out, were very crude when it came to food deserts. So people have what's called agency. You don't have to, it's the opposite of determinism. Determinism is that you're going to do something based on your geography, your culture, things like that. But every human has free will to do what they're going to do. And this became very stark when the USDA started looking at the results of putting supermarkets in neighborhoods and adding these, what Guthman called supply side remedies to the obesogenic environment. And what they actually found was that people, even if they walk or bike or anything, they tend to pass the closest place to go to the places that they want to buy their food from. So people travel to get their food. And they'll borrow a vehicle, things like that. But overall, as you can see here, the mean distance, if you look at to nearest SNAP authorized supermarket, so SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Program, food stamps, if you look at how close it is, which is in blue here, and then you look at how far they actually traveled, which is in orange here, people tend to travel almost twice as far to get their food than their local supermarket. So putting supermarkets in neighborhoods did not fix the problem. And conversely then, if you look at it, it wasn't causing people to be obese. And I like this quote here that came from a popular article, that you can build a Whole Foods, but you can't get people to buy organic kale. And that's very true. Other issues, there's a lot of factors that go into being obese. Obviously, there's what she talked about as the energy balance model, right? If you take in too much food and you don't exercise, you will get fat, right? And that's traditionally the way that we've always looked at obesity. But there's many other factors, especially with a lot of the research right now in what's known as epigenetics. When you look at epigenetics, you can have two people that are genetically similar, even like twins, but based on certain genes that are clicked on and off from environmental reasons. You could have one person be bigger than the other person. They could be exactly the same. They could eat the same food even. So there's a lot of variables that go into what makes people fat. So here's a short little clip on what epigenetics is, because I think it's really important that people begin understanding these concepts.
So say you have a clone or a secret identical twin, because you know that a twin or a clone is a genetically identical person to you, which is crazy, but it's true. Anyway, so you have this clone or your twin or what have you, and your parents decide that it's too much trouble to keep both of you. And so they give your clone to a kind of sketchy traveling circus. Now I know your parents probably wouldn't actually do this, but just roll with me for a minute. So for the purposes of this example, let's just say that you grew up living a normal suburban American life, while your clone grew up with less stability and less access to nutritious food and less education, but more exercise and more access to sword swallowers and bearded ladies. And let's say you guys are 50 years old or whatever, you get together and have some lunch. So you're sitting there across the table from your clone. What do you think you see? Well, for starters, Clone probably has a tattoo on its face. And if Clone had stayed in the circus, Clone probably, professionally rides a unicycle over a tightrope, so Clone is probably in pretty good shape. But then again, Clone probably smokes cigarettes and probably was malnourished as a child, so might be slightly shorter than you. By the same token, let's say that you've been eating Sonic tater tots 5 days a week since 1992, so you're looking a little bit tubby. Plus, you spent the last 20 years at a really stressful job that puts you at risk for all kinds of weird health complications. So, at 50, you and Clone would probably look pretty different from one another. But it turns out, you don't just look different, you actually have become different. Now, if some scientists looked at your genetic code, they would say that your DNA was still exactly the same as that other person. That is to say, if your genome is a paragraph, all of the letters would be in the exact same order. But on another level, there would be a huge difference, and if we extend this metaphor, we can say that the letters are in the same order, but the spaces and the punctuation are all in different places. Of course, completely, potentially changing the message of that paragraph. The study of this genetic punctuation that I'm talking about is called epigenetics, which literally means above genetics. The epigenome doesn't change your DNA, but it decides how much or whether some genes are expressed in different cells in your body. Epigenetics looks at what happens to your genes over the course of your life and whether those changes could be passed down to your children or even your grandchildren. So here's the way epigenetics works. You have billions of cells in your body, and they each contain your DNA, the same exact blueprint of your genetic code. But just because they have the DNA doesn't mean that they know what to do with it. They need outside instruction from these little carbon and hydrogen compounds called methyl groups. The way these methyl groups control the genome is by binding to a gene and saying, do not express this gene. The methyl groups bind differently to your genome in a skin cell versus, say, a tongue cell or an eyeball cell. And that is one of the ways that a cell knows that, hey, I'm a skin cell, or hey, I'm an eyeball cell, or hey, I'm a muscle cell. In addition to methyl groups, epigenetics is also controlled by histones, which are proteins that are basically the spools that DNA winds itself around. Histones can change how tightly or loosely the DNA is wound around them. If they're more loosely wound, the genes can express more, and if they're more tightly wound, then they express less. So whereas the methyl groups are more like a switch, the histones are more like a knob. Every cell in your body has a distinct methylation and histone pattern. And that is what gives every cell its marching orders. Think of your genome, the DNA, as the actual hardware of the computer, while the epigenome is more like the software, which tells the hardware what to do. The genome is what's going to be doing all the work, but the epigenome is going to be telling it what to do. So the hardware of your DNA is going to be the same throughout your entire life. But these epigenetic tags do change throughout your life, and they decide what genes get expressed or not. Now, epigenetic information in a cell isn't permanent. It can change throughout your life, and it can be hereditary. And it can change over time, especially when your body is going through a lot of changes, like, say, during puberty. A bunch of methyl groups kick in and they're like, okay, so you guys over here, you're gonna have to start growing hair, and you guys over here, I really need you guys to get behind giving this guy some really horrible acne. Or like when you get pregnant, which hopefully I won't, but when you do, your epigenome has to be like, all right, guys, everything's about to get a whole lot bigger in here, and we're gonna have to pass something the size of like a Merriam-Webster's dictionary through that little pipe over there, so let's get this thing done. But it's not just these dramatic times when the epigenome is changing. It changes subtly throughout our entire lives. And it changes based on a lot of environmental factors, like what we do, what we eat, what we smoke, and how stressed out we are on a daily basis. Scientists have found that things like a bad diet can actually lead to methyl groups binding to the wrong place and making mistakes. And with those bad instructions, cells become abnormal and become a disease. And then basically all hell breaks loose and you get cancer or something. Epigenetics is a very young science, though we've known about the epigenome since the 1970s. It's only in the last 20 years that we've even known what effect these epigenetic tags are having on our DNA. And even after they got all that business straight, scientists still thought that all of our epigenetic tags were stripped off of our genome before they were passed on to our children. So if you started smoking 10 packs a day when you were 10 years old, that would certainly be a horrible health decision for you, but you wouldn't necessarily be harming your unborn children in any measurable way. However, the thinking on that is changing pretty rapidly, because it's true that a lot, even most of the epigenetic information from a parent is stripped off of the embryo's genome in the first few days, and fresh ones are created specifically for this new person. However, some of these tags get stuck on the genome and are passed down from generation to generation. And it just so happens that the more they study this, the more it looks like bad epigenetic information is being passed from generation to generation. And this is a whole new way to think about how we pass information between generations. Your grandmother was making dietary decisions that affect you today. As we experience all of these new strange epidemics, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, cancers that weren't appearing in previous generations, it's starting to look like these may be caused by epigenetic information passed down from our parents. I know, it's such an unbelievable buzzkill. There is no point in our lives when we can do anything without guilt anymore. The discovery that the environmental factors of parent experiences can be passed down from generation to generation was sparked in the 1980s. And this happened when some scientists were looking at the birth and death records of some people who lived in 19th century Sweden. This is a weird place to find a genetic revolution, but there it is. It wasn't just any place in Sweden. It was in Norrbotten, which is the northernmost county in Sweden, which is literally in the Arctic Circle. And despite the fact that Norrbotten was literally the worst place you could possibly choose to live in Sweden, there were some people living there in the 1800s. And they were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Let me clarify. These people were isolated. Like, if they didn't have a good crop year, people died. No, it wasn't ideal, but, you know, they didn't ask me my opinion, so I'm not giving it. So anyway, these people subsisted entirely on what they grew and the animals that they raised. And like I said, sometimes they starved. But sometimes they had huge, bountiful years of plenty. And when that happened, people totally went ape crackers. I mean, of course they did, because they were so freaking hungry, and then all of a sudden there was all this damn food everywhere. Anyway, there was a public health specialist who was looking at the effects of the people who grew up in the really bad starving periods of time versus the people who grew up in the eat all you can at the smorgasbord years. And you might already be guessing what they found out. People who went from relatively slim pickings to feed your face until you have to barf and then do it all over again in a single season, those people died an average of 6 years sooner than their starved out counterparts. And you know what sucks? So do their kids. And so do their kids' kids. Boo epigenetics. So, of course, now we all know, and we're all going to stop doing unhealthy things starting today. Unless the damage is already done. The damage is almost certainly already done. But hey, epigenetics brings good tidings along with the bad ones. For instance, we now know that certain types of cancer are caused by misplaced epigenetic tags, and scientists are now developing drugs that can silence the bad genes that were supposed to be turned off in the first place. Additionally, until recently, we thought that genes were the end-all and be-all of who you got to be. They were your blueprint, and you couldn't escape them. This outlook is not just kind of depressing, it also leads to a yucky sort of social prejudice. Because when you look at data without considering social and epigenetic factors, it might look like people with less money are less intelligent. So just like 15 years ago, there were scientists saying things in public, mind you, like, some people just have good genes for intelligence, and it just so happens that the poor people don't. Oh, it's so sad. Too bad, poor people. But you have bad genes. Well, it turns out that that is not even a little bit true. Not only are there a huge variety of social factors that affect how well people do on intelligence tests, but a genetic trait is also not just a product of genes, it's also a product of environment. Any one person's genome is determined by any number of decisions made by any number of their ancestors. And right now, you are making decisions that are going to affect people who are alive long after you're dead. No pressure or anything. And so I'm glad you've watched this, because when you and your clone are in your 60s and you sit down, have lunch, and he brings his son and his son has a tattoo on his face, he did not inherit that from you.
One other unfortunate consequence of designating places food deserts is money tends to be funneled toward development, which actually will begin gentrifying a neighborhood. So as Guthman says, the causality may not be the neighborhood. A neighborhood may just be the reflection of the people of a certain socioeconomic level in that neighborhood. So for example, GFS just opened a store on Michigan Street, which has a lot of fresh vegetables, a lot of good food in it. But the money that was put in place for the development that GFS put their food store into was partly supported by food desert funds. The developers were able to gain a $3.5 million loan, a very low interest loan, because the development was in a food desert. So the USDA was able to offer them this loan. And because of that, they were able to build the development there called Diamond Place. And they consider this an affordable development, but as someone that's lived in this neighborhood for quite a while, I can attest that most of the people in the neighborhood that were already here really can't afford to live in even the ones that are considered to be affordable. If you look at what a one-bedroom apartment there is $1,000. And, 10 years ago in this neighborhood, or even less, a house was much less than that to rent. So they were able to leverage these funds because it was designated a USDA food desert. So beyond there being bad indicators, this money can actually be used for things that will possibly push people out into neighborhoods that don't have as good of food access. So when you look at how this was designated, the Gordon store was right here in the middle, and those green spaces are where people have to travel over a mile to get to a supermarket, or at least most of the people, and the brown ones where people have to travel half a mile to get to a supermarket. And if you look on here, there is a supermarket on the corner of each of these food deserts. So it was kind of an interesting designation, considering it's sandwiched in between two family fairs. Also, the Fulton Street Farmers Market is not far. Actually, it's less than a mile from the GFS store. And there's also some smaller markets, such as there's a Guatemalan store on the corner of Diamond and Fulton, which wasn't counted in the food desert designation. There's a lot of restaurants. The reason I put up the restaurants here is because, as Guthman said, these are also a poor indicator because they don't designate, they don't differentiate what type of restaurant it is. So as you go down Michigan Street, you'll see Paleo, which is a high-end Italian restaurant, and then you got Wendy's and Checkers and all those other ones like that, and then Bill's down at the end, which is a diner that's been there a while, been there a long time, a breakfast food joint. And I just wanted to put these on here to show you within this neighborhood, there's multiple different types of food from different types of places, and this designation really putting this GFS here as part of this development with really high rents comparatively to what they were historically has already tended to push people out. A lot of the people that lived north of Michigan had to leave, and there's also people that just can't afford the rents anymore in the neighborhood, and they're moving out to different places, which Guthman would consider food swamps. So there's a lot of issues with this food desert designation. It had good intentions, but on the ground, it's tending to do the opposite of what it intended to do. One of the most important factors is race. We still are redlining neighborhoods. So redlining is a term that had to do with when neighborhoods became more minority, banks would quit giving away loans for housing in there, and they literally drew red lines around neighborhoods and said, we are not going to give loans in these neighborhoods, and it was because they were black, because they were minorities, is why this happened. And it's still happening. This is from 2013. This is from a City Lab article. There's a lot of suburbs in Chicago that are becoming more African American. And there actually are less food stores in these suburbs than there are in white suburbs. And when someone was asked about this, especially when it came to restaurants, someone actually said at a community meeting that was a representative from the restaurants that black people don't tip, right? And so that's why, we're not going to put restaurants in there. Just blatant racism. And this is true all over the United States. Minority neighborhoods do have less options. Whether this causes food insecurity or whether it causes obesity, it's one factor, yes, amongst a lot of other factors, with poverty being another huge one. So we have massive inequality in health, in food access, in nutrition, in obesity, things like this. And it's more than just where people live. It's who people are and how they are treated by the society, and especially how they're treated by the economy. So that's kind of an overview of food security from a global and a local perspective. There's more in the readings, obviously, but I wanted to kind of talk about some of the terms so you can understand them better. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what's being done to try to make people more food secure locally and around the world. You are going to read a couple chapters, one chapter on food banks, local food organizations, they call them, and also a short article about food banks and some of the criticisms of food banking. But the UN has declared that food is actually a human right, and it is up to governments to make sure that people are fed. And denying people food is actually a violation of human rights. Hence the reason why we have things like SNAP benefits. If you look here, the Farm Bill, 80%, almost 80% of the Farm Bill is spent on feeding people, on nutrition, education, and SNAP benefits. And most people that actually are on SNAP benefits are actually working. That's actually it's actually a myth to say that most people are just have food benefits and aren't doing anything. And now currently they're trying to propose to make people have to work to get their benefits, which in a way could be a violation of this UN Human Rights Declaration. Around the world, the U.S. has sent aid to multiple countries to help their governments also feed people. And it's become a real contentious issue, even in current politics. If you look right now, what's going on in Central America with the immigrants moving their way up, with the whole caravan thing going up, they're talking about, our federal government is threatening to quit sending aid to be able to feed people. But this is one way that throughout the world, governments that have the money are able to have in the past and still are sending aid to places so people can have nutritious food. Here's a quick little movie put out by the FAO talking about how healthcare and human and also food access is a human right, and this is led by people that really think about that idea of structural violence, that there's certain people in the world beyond their control, they don't have access to food, either through war, direct violence, or structures in their society that don't allow them to have enough money to be able to purchase food. Adjustment programs in some countries have made it so indigenous groups and other groups don't have access to be able to grow their own food anymore and things like that.
Enough food is produced to feed everyone, but almost 800 million people currently suffer from chronic hunger. The right to adequate food is a human right. It is also a legal obligation under international law.
The world is producing enough food to feed everyone.
It's often a question of access, and this is where our work comes in.
The Universal Declaration mentions the right to a standard of living, including access to food, education, health, housing.
The right to food is one which needs a highest level of protection, a constitutional level. Whether we are in times of emergency or we are in times of development, this human right needs to always be addressed and protected.
States have obligations. They solve the problems through policies, and policies can be improved adopting a right to food approach.
The guidelines offer 19 different areas for policy support, and all member countries of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN have adopted it.
All the countries need all the measures, or most of them, but they have to implement in a way that matches their reality.
They can be customized according to the national context. And this is the power of this tool, is that it can be used by many different actors and many different countries.
PANTHER is the acronym of 7 principles that are very useful to understand what is a human rights-based approach.
The PANTHER principles are participation, accountability, non-discrimination, transparency, human dignity, empowerment, and the rule of law.
I think that also in the last 15 years, we have good examples of countries that were able to reach an agreement, a consensus, design policies, implement policies, and have an impact.
This is a sign that times are changing. This is a sign that things are moving in the right direction, and make sure that hunger and malnutrition become an issue of the past.
So private food assistance programs such as food banks, things like that. Here's a shot right of Google Maps that shows all the food pantries in Grand Rapids. Providing food for people at no cost, where they can go to the pantry and pick up the food, in many ways is a great thing, and in other ways it may actually reify poverty, so it may actually reinforce poverty, and a lot of times it may people won't even take advantage of it because of the shame that may be involved with that. We tend to measure how well we do based on, you know, the weight that these companies, because they are really corporations, the weight of the food that they distribute, and then that's how they deal with their outcomes instead of the quality of the food. And the Fisher article you read talks a little bit about that. So here's a TED Talk that talks about a woman that worked in one of these food pantries, and she's realizing that it may not be the best way for us to actually provide food for people. And then there's another video after this that talks about in Canada some alternative ways they've figured out of through private organizations. So this isn't SNAP benefit type things, but actually a card that food banks can provide that work with local retailers so people can actually buy healthy food.
"5 years ago, I learned that we can transform the health of our next generation, and all we have to do is replace dangerous misconception with truth and compassion." I come from a place of privilege. Every day I get to decide if my children eat fresh, local, and even organic food. I have the opportunity every day to teach my children to love a variety of food that's nourishing, full of flavor, aroma, and texture. I never have to worry if my children are going to run out of food, and I never have to put them to bed with an empty belly. Unfortunately, this is not the case for 1 in 5 children in the United States, and it's much worse in my hometown, where 1 in 4 children do not know where their next meal is coming from and often go to school unable to learn at their maximum capacity. I want you to imagine the last time you experienced hunger. Did you get a headache? Did you feel nauseous? Or are you like me and get aggravated, frustrated, extremely impatient, and just a little intolerable? Now imagine walking over to your refrigerator, opening it up just to see that it's completely empty. And you walk over to your wallet to learn you do not have money to buy food for the rest of the month. This is food insecurity. Food insecurity can also occur when a person does not have enough money to buy nourishing food. They might rely on pancake mix or instant noodles to feed their children every single day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This too is food insecurity. While food insecurity impacts everyone's health negatively, it is particularly crushing to children. Nourishing food is critical to a child's mental, emotional, and physical development. When a person does not have access to food, they feel shame, alienation, and even inequalities. They feel they're powerless over their food choices. As a registered dietitian, I've spent the last 15 years working with food assistance programs such as SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, Women, Infant, and Children, known as WIC, the National School Lunch Program, and many more. I thought I was empathetic to hunger in the United States. While I knew nearly 50 million people are impacted by food insecurity daily, I never took the time to be a witness to hunger. In my private practice, I jumped at the opportunity to teach my clients how to adopt a healthy lifestyle. I was eager to persuade my clients to cook with fresh produce. I even went so far to call food poisonous and toxic if it came in a box or was processed. I, like many other healthcare professionals, was missing an important piece of the puzzle. I never stopped and asked my clients if they could afford the very foods I was asking them to buy. You see, it was 5 years ago I became the president of a large food pantry where we serve 600 families throughout the year. When I started, I was harboring a nasty, horrible, and embarrassing little secret. I assumed our clients coming into the food pantry would be taking advantage of our program. In some cases, I thought some of our clients would be uneducated and even lazy. My misconceptions about poverty were completely wrong. I assumed that the majority of people who were poor were so because of generational poverty at the expense of taxpayers. According to the United States Census Bureau, 34% of our population has had one spell of poverty lasting 2 or more months, while less than 3% of our population lived in chronic poverty the entire 4 years of that study. In other words, the majority of people in the United States experiencing food insecurity and poverty do so because of temporary situations such as a loss of a job, a disability diagnosis, the birth of a child. My misconceptions were wrong, and unfortunately there are many people who share my same misconception. To make it worse, there are many people in the United States who need and qualify for food assistance, but do not utilize programs because of their own internalized shame and the social stigma surrounding food assistance programs. Last year, I was recruited by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics to be a leader in the Community Voice Project. The purpose of this project was to bring the real faces of hunger to Congress, not just statistics. And for the first time in my life, I had the opportunity to sit down and listen to the stories of my clients who lived with and often overcame hunger. I heard powerful messages of resourcefulness and motivation. During that time, I had family members, community members, neighbors, and friends reach out to me in private, and they said, I have a story and I want to share it with you. They had 3 things in common. The first, their bout of poverty was situational. Second, they were and still are leaders in our community who contribute to society every single day. Third, They were so embarrassed that they had to use food assistance program for a short period of time that they did not want me to take their story public, and they certainly did not want me to take it to Congress. During this time, I had a childhood friend approach me. She said, Clancy, I have a story for you, but I don't think it's what you're seeking. I've never been homeless, I'm not a survivor of domestic violence, and I'm not a single mom. But I used WIC, and it saved me. She talked about having a great life in Colorado and going to the doctor to learn that she's not only pregnant with baby number 2, but baby number 3, twins. A couple months go by, and she learns that one of her twins was diagnosed with spina bifida. Unable to breastfeed, she had to rely on specialized medical formula to feed her twins. On top of new and profound medical expenses, she was paying $1,200 a month for formula. This is more than the average mortgage payment in the United States. She talked about going to the grocery store, standing in line, the cashier says, aisle 4, WIC verification, aisle 4. My friend was mortified. Not only is there an inpatient line behind her, but now the entire store is aware that she is shopping with food assistance to buy her groceries. And to make it worse, the lady directly behind her said, excuse me, but is that the new iPhone? Yeah, it is. The lady said, well, now that's just really interesting, isn't it? From that point forward, my friend talked about shopping in the middle of the night when her kids were sleeping, going across town so no one would recognize her. She described having a love-hate relationship with food assistance. She loved it because she was able to nourish her twins. She hated it because of the social stigma she received. If we are serious about improving the health of our next generation, we must dismantle the stigma associated with food assistance programs. In order to do that, we need to understand that the face of hunger is fluid. The face of poverty is constantly changing. At a moment's notice, any one of us at any time can find ourselves in a life-changing situation, such as a natural disaster, a divorce, a death of a family member, a breakdown of a car. We often visualize the real face of hunger as someone with a swollen belly, visible ribs, and skinny limbs. The reality is, the real face of hunger looks like you and me. One day I was sitting at the food pantry having a great day, and this gentleman walked in, and he looked amazing. He's in his 20s, 30s, wearing a suit. He came up to me, he said, who's in charge? I immediately got super excited because you know what? In my mind, I'm thinking, I'm going to get a check. I'm going to get a donation for the food pantry, and guess what? I'm going to be able to help more people. When I told him I was in charge, he held his head low, and he whispered, I've been looking for a job for 2 months. I have 3 kids and a wife. I can't go home empty-handed today. Wow. Again, my assumptions. I work with a life-changing program called the Ruth Matthews Berger Women with Children's Program at Misericordia University. This program is breaking the cycle of poverty 2 generations at a time. The Women with Children's Program inspires and empowers women to achieve a 4-year college education. In this program, we teach the women that food assistance is a hand up, not a hand out. Unfortunately, this is not the normal messaging in our society. If we're going to win the war on hunger in our communities, we must shift the way we talk, treat, and view poverty and food assistance in the United States. If you have ever utilized a food assistance program such as the National School Lunch Program, be proud. Don't be afraid to talk about how it transformed your life. Would you have passed your spelling test? Would you have graduated? Would you be where you are today if you did not have access to school lunch every single day? What I want for you is to understand the power of your words. Speak out against the social stigma surrounding food assistance programs. Open up your heart, speak your truth, and embrace all of the powerful stories that surround you.
Canada in the 80s, a time when workers faced vanishing jobs, homelessness, and hunger. But other than the Salvation Army, there wasn't much help for those in need. With governments unwilling to act, it fell on regular people to take action. That's when the idea of a food bank was born, not as a long-term measure, but as something temporary until the wealth could trickle down as government promised. Today, there are more than 800 food banks across the country, feeding close to 1 million Canadians. But are food banks the best way to serve the hungry?
Food banks are always running out of food. They have to have stricter rationing. They're stigmatizing. They deny people's dignity and choice, which I think is a sort of fundamental in terms of human dignity, in the sense of having enough money in your pocket and going into a food store like anybody else and being able to purchase your own food.
It feels terrible never having enough money. You feel like your self-esteem is taken away sometimes because you feel very low class. I'm on disability, and by the time I pay my rent, I'm lucky if I have a couple dollars left over for groceries once my bills are paid.
Food banks work well for big food corporations, as they can unload unwanted food while getting tax breaks.
You have to think about this from the business side. They want tax relief. They want a cheaper way of getting rid of their food. They want to be seen, though, to be doing their environmental bit. But the problem is it doesn't actually achieve this, and the studies, the research shows that this is not actually what's occurring.
In Woodstock, Ontario, a small multi-denominational church group may have found a more humane way to help those in need. 9 years ago, it closed its food bank and started a program called Food for Friends. In this program, hungry people are given a plastic card to buy their own food. Funding for the card comes from grocery shoppers.
People are asked to donate 25 cents, some donate more when they go shopping, and they track it, and they write us a check every month for the amount that they collect. It goes directly back on the cards for those who need them.
The grocery stores collect the money and hand it over to the Food for Friends program. Then, clients are given their own card, much like a debit card.
They can get their card, they can use coupons, and they can get taxable items from us. And then they can go to any one of the participating stores and use these cards. They're one-time use cards only. They're not electronic, although we do put an electronic strip on the back so that it makes it a little more inconspicuous.
Chris Chapman runs the Foodland grocery store in Woodstock.
They come in the store, they can buy whatever they like as long as it's not taxable. The idea is to get the people in here so that they can buy food for their family and food that they want.
It's the food card that gives me more dignity because I can go out and pick what I want instead of being given what somebody else thinks I should have. It's hard to admit that you're on the system. People really look down on you. It's not a choice.
Everybody has downturns in their life, and a lot of people, it's only a limited thing, and then 6 months later, they're on the upswing and they're rocking along. If I can treat someone like that right at this stage in their life, then maybe I'm going to win a customer down the road.
The Food for Friends card program is so successful that other, much larger food banks are rethinking their program. Glenn Pearson, co-director of London Food Bank, believes it's time we took a serious look at the politics of food.
We're saying to people, if you're an average citizen, go to a grocery store if you want food. Go to a market, whatever. If you're poor, go to a food bank. So we have two doors. We have a two-tier system. And what we're trying to say is it's time to change that, you know, food and the access to food is the new civil rights thing. It's the new gender thing. We have to work towards where people get equal access.
Equal access to food, or food as a human rights issue, is not something we think about. Professor Rich blames the media, especially the CBC, for supporting food charity days at the expense of other basic human rights.
If you're going to have a food charity day, why don't you have a right to food day? Why doesn't the CBC support adequate welfare benefits? Why doesn't it support the living wage? Why doesn't it support adequate childcare? Why doesn't it support social housing? Why aren't you explicit about that when you're explicit in supporting charity? Because charity is very much part of a right-wing agenda.
Steve Giuliano believes the only way to ensure that enough food is available for everyone is to shut down food banks across Canada.
I believe that the food bank system has become so indoctrinated that we have dug ourselves a very deep hole, and we're going to have to dig ourselves out shovel by shovelful. We aren't going to do this overnight, but it can be done, and I believe that we can do something very wonderful that can support a lot of less fortunate people in this country if we're willing to try.
We are just as good people as anybody else, and we deserve to have the food and the opportunity just like everybody else.
Another important thing that's happening with food security is supporting small farmers. A lot of the research that's been done is showing that small farmers are actually feeding the world. And a lot of small farmers are losing their farmland at a pretty alarming rate through either structural adjustment programs or war or revolutions, things like that. If you look at Guatemala, Guatemala's a great story. Well, it's a sad story of from the 50s on, small landowners kept losing their land because they could no longer afford the taxes for them. And big corporations such as United Fruit came in and bought up all that land, and now they work on plantations instead of growing their own food. And when small farmers in places like Africa and throughout the global south, they feed a huge segment of the society. And when small farmers lose their land, they can no longer support those local economies. So there's a lot of public and private programs that are figuring out ways to sustainably have small farmers grow, begin to use new techniques that make them more efficient, and be able to feed their own people. The Zero Hunger Challenge from the World Health Organization and other things like that are providing the resources necessary for farmers to be able to produce. One of them is the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, which has been a very successful program in getting small farmers around the world to be able to grow food. And we are one of the largest contributors to that. So $600 million we sent at one time. But the current administration actually has decided to no longer fund this, so we'll see what the future holds in this. They're going to lose a huge chunk, a huge chunk of that funding, and it's something to keep your eye on to see if how these countries that have been supplied with these resources, how they fare when they lose a big chunk of that funding. And to bring it back on a local level here, this idea of food sovereignty, this goes back to the idea of having control of your own food. There's a lot of organizations in the United States right now that are trying to figure out ways to go into neighborhoods that maybe don't have the food access they need, or at the same time are just highly food insecure, mainly because of poverty and because of other forms of inequality. Locally in Grand Rapids, we have Our Kitchen Table. They work on urban gardening programs and things like that. And another really big one right now is happening in Muskegon. So here's a quick film about what's going on in Muskegon to try to figure out how to get people to grow their own food, and really think about controlling their own food destiny.
The Healthy Muskegon Initiative is a community food network and re-granting program that encourages collaboration and resource sharing to existing and new food projects in the communities of Muskegon and Muskegon Heights, all in an effort to create what we call a community-based food system and to level the playing field for vulnerable children in our communities. A community food network transforms systems and cultures and creates opportunities in food, education, and entrepreneurialism. Kids are learning that planting and growing food can lead to a livelihood, and preparing and eating food can create a healthier lifestyle.
Healthy food is a basic human right, and it's when you look at the map of food deserts in our area, Muskegon and Muskegon Heights, City of Muskegon and Muskegon Heights are both identified as regions where people don't have appropriate access to healthy food. And from the Foundation's perspective, we saw this as a real opportunity to be able to engage the community and help make connections and really have the whole be greater than the sum of the parts as each of these community groups put forth their efforts to try and increase that access to healthy food.
If kids in the inner city could raise their own plants, produce their own food, that they would be much more interested in actually in tasting it and at least trying it. And that was a major impetus for me to begin work here.
Healthy Muskegon has allowed us to expand our farm into another farm. We combine forces with another grantee, the Growing Goods Project.
Well, I coordinate the Growing Goods Project, which is a project that brings together high school youth with middle school youth to grow local organic produce.
We grow about, I think, 15 different varieties of veggies, and these all go directly to the summer school program.
That's a huge change in how our school food systems function, and I think will really have an impact on those kids as they continue to move forward in their work and in their lives, knowing where the food came from, knowing that they can earn a living as a farmer, that they have been part of changing the food system and how it actually works.
We had over 175 meals per day for 6 weeks straight, with food coming directly from the garden, grown by youth that we hired with grant dollars from the Healthy Muskegon Project.
We weed and harvest, and then we showed kids like how to do it too, and they would help us work in the garden, and they would use that food at the middle school, and so then they would eat it, and so it was like a connection between working here and then getting to eat the food that they grew.
With the Healthy Muskegon Initiative, we actually put a lot more ownership of the project on the youth.
I see that these kids, they need some kind of mentor in their life, somebody to get them that voice in their head that tell them to keep going, like that they can do it, because you gotta understand, they're coming here, they didn't pass school when it was just going. So in the summer, they don't want to be here, so I gotta make them feel better.
It started with wanting to teach kids life skills, and what it's turned into is actually engaging in life skill practice with them. That's huge. I can't even really say how exciting that is for me as a person that's been involved with it.
We purchased a mobile food unit that we could then take to the farmers market and out to food trucks to demonstrate healthy recipes, to give people some inspiration and some ideas of what they can do with all this great food that we have here at the market and different fruits and vegetables. The more people we meet at the farmers market, the more that this project can expand into the community and into maybe some parts of the community that are difficult to reach.
Pioneer Resources received the grant from them for this new program, Food for Thought, and I was then hired to help run and set up the program. So I'm their vocational trainer, educator, And so that's my tie-in. Healthy Muskegon gave me a job. I am a very firm believer that you can't talk about nutrition without talking about gardens and growing the actual food. Getting students to eat food, one of the best ways to do it is to have them grow it. Grow it, cook it, anything. The more involved they are, the better. And this program and Healthy Muskegon is all about getting kids, getting the community right in the dirt, right in the kitchen, involved, and that leads to better nutrition because they're more excited about it. They're invested in it.
This living laboratory, hands-on opportunity for our kids just reinforces what the teachers are doing in the classroom in regards to enhancing reading, writing, arithmetic, and science kinds of things. And so it's created a win-win situation for the whole educational effort of Mosaica and Muskegon Heights Public Schools Academy.
And the little kindergarten and first graders here have almost no knowledge about plants or the food that they're eating. I showed them a potato the other day and nobody in the whole class knew what it was. But they all knew what French fries were, and they had no idea that, that their French fries grew underneath the ground and they had to go and dig for them in order to make them.
Some of these kids will actually take that know-how with them up through the grade years and help their parents grow equally the things that they have been nurturing here in their own educational gardens here at their local schools.
Kids Food Basket is attacking hunger one sack supper at a time. In Muskegon, we're serving close to 600 students in Muskegon Heights this year. The Coalition for Community Development is a great example of we're both serving the same populations in Muskegon Heights, and we're so appreciative of the opportunity to partner together because of the Kellogg grant, to be able to provide more fruits and vegetables for kids, but also that learning opportunity as well.
Love Community Garden is in downtown Muskegon and provides raised beds and garden space for community members to grow food. Through the Healthy Muskegon program, it's recently added a hoop house for season extension. Love runs a youth program and delivers fresh produce to area seniors and families. Love was at the Muskegon Farmers Market this year, offering chemically-free produce at affordable prices, and also grows food for Kids Food Basket, another Healthy Muskegon grantee. And Love Community Garden has more collaborations in the works for this fall.
To sit down with the kids and eat this food with them that they had grown and watch them be excited about eating kale chips. It's really hard to change someone's diet to begin with. So if you get them early on and you kind of show them new things, especially healthy options.
So as we move forward, we invite you to join the network and collaborate with us and help us to create change in the communities of Muskegon and Muskegon Heights.
So finally, I want to finish with talking a little bit about some of the evidence-based research on what actually does work. So that myopic notion of just, we can just put supermarkets into places and people are going to eat healthy isn't exactly how it works. That's part of it, but that's just one piece. We need better education. We need education that is not heavily influenced by lobbying groups. We need education that's not heavily influenced by corporations. We need honest, good food education. What's good for you to eat? When I showed that scale where it showed the two arrows going up and down, we need to teach people that, eating more fruits and vegetables and fruits and nuts and fish and good oils and things like that, that is how you can become healthy, and showing people how they can afford those things if they shop certain ways. We need to provide subsidies for growing healthy food, not just for growing things like corn. A very small percentage of our corn production actually goes to food. The vast majority of it goes to either sweeteners or industrial products such as biofuels and things like that. We need wellness programs in schools and in workplaces, and to teach people about what it means to grow good food, and where good food comes from, and how you can exercise and not exercise in ways that, exercise in ways that are actually culturally appropriate to the people you're talking to, and food that's culturally appropriate. Not just going into a neighborhood and saying, you need to go to the farmer's market when you maybe don't feel comfortable going to farmers markets, right? And this is part of it, supermarkets should be in all neighborhoods. They should be accessible. And if it's found that companies aren't going into neighborhoods just because of the makeup of the neighborhood, just because the neighborhood may be minorities, or it may show that they don't have the money to buy food, but everyone spends money on food. And it doesn't make any sense to have certain parts of a country like ours to not have stores where people can buy healthy food. And finally, we need better standards. We need to regulate things. Maybe make it more expensive to buy things that aren't good for you and less expensive to buy things that are good for you. This can happen. It's happened in other countries. The Cook Islands example, where they put just high rates on things like soda and things like that, people start eating different ways. And these aren't my own personal perspectives. This is a review that was done based on all of the literature they could find that talked about positive outcomes from things people have done in neighborhoods and have done around the United States. So this is actually evidence-based, science-based, research-based. These are things that can actually get people to start eating healthy again. So I want you to read the chapter on food banks, kind of think about that a little bit. Also read the article by Fisher that talks a little bit about the issues of food banks and the people that tend to be on food bank councils don't match the people that are taking advantage of the food banks. There's a lot of inequality going on with that. So make sure you check those out, and you should actually post to the forum, and we'll see you.